So we move on to France. The United Kingdom is the oldest modern democracy. The US is the oldest constitutional democracy, since the UK doesn't have a constitution. And then France is the oldest democracy on the continent of Europe, composed of 60 million people. Not Europe composed of 60, France composed of 60 million people. So this is important because we've talked about the evolution of the state. And I want you to think a little bit about what this might mean. France being the oldest democracy on the continent. Now, if France adopts democracy, what does that mean for other states on the continent? And we'll talk about this with respect to Napoleon's rampage and all that, which we've talked about a little bit earlier. But this does put on competitive pressures towards other states in the region. Of course, France's, as you'll see, France's move towards democracy is not unilateral. It goes back and forth. So if you hear this singing, that's Maya right next to me. So she won't sing very loud. Right, Maya? No. Okay, so France is really typical Europe, where you've got strong geographic borders. You've got historically better relations between states. So France gets along generally fine with Spain and Switzerland. You've got big mountains. We've talked about going to the Pyrenees. We haven't because it costs a lot. But we're going to go someday, and they're beautiful mountains. And then, of course, the Alps are incredible mountains. Italy. So we're talking about pretty good relations with these states. Not such good relations when you're talking about, this flat land over here, right? And who's over here? Who's that? That's Germany. And so we've had some rough relations between France and Germany, pretty bad neighborly relations overall. Paris is the country's hub. About 15% of the population lives in Paris, and all the political power is centralized in Paris. So this is important. This is very typical of many countries around the world where the population center is really in the capital city. This is where the jobs are. This is where people flock to. France is a lot like America in that there's a lot of pride and distrust in the state. It could be sort of why we get along like bratty brothers, because we are actually quite similar to each other. And this really emerges from our historic, a revolutionary process from a political culture perspective, how we got to democracy. We fought for democracy, okay? And so there is this distrust in the state in contrast to what we see in the British case. With respect to ethnicity, you're talking about a country that's 85% Catholic, but it promotes secularism. I'm going to throw out my little French here. Laïcité. Oh, how is that? Ooh, French speakers are cringing. Yeah, I took French until 8th grade. So laïcité. Hope that was better. It's this idea of subordinating religious identity to national identity and this strong secularism. That's what this laïcité really is. Muslims make up about 10% of the population, though there are varying levels of religiosity. But this is a religion which is much more involved in daily life than Christianity for those who are more religious. And it's becoming controversial, especially because French identity is not multicultural. French identity is, it's French. In 2004, this came out when you had a law that banned religious symbols in schools. And these religious symbols included headscarves. Actually, many young Muslims appear to support this, but it's been very controversial. In 2010, you had a law banning the hijab, the full veil in public. This frequently comes out, and this highlights this conflict between natural population decline and the need for immigrants, and then what sort of immigrants you want to have. They're not all going to be French. So we'll talk a little bit about French evolution before we get into France's institutions. The map that you see here, right over here, is a map of France at the death of Charlemagne, and it really broke up into little pieces. This is actually France is a great example of the lessons from the state building literature, where you had the Frankish under Charlemagne who united in the 9th century, and then you had the first unified state in all of Europe. Okay, so going back to our state evolutionary lesson, this is the first unified state. It's also a personalistic regime, and given what we learned about state building, we can talk about what might account for the unification of France before the UK, I'll give you a little pause. What might account for this? Why the unification of France before the UK? Competition. Bang. The UK was on an island. They didn't have enemies all over the place. France did. And so this is what happened. France unified, became a strong state. But then, hey, look, a personalistic regime, what happens to personalistic regimes when the ruler dies? Well, you get a struggle for power among those with ambition. And so Charlemagne dies, and sure enough, unified France breaks up into small feudal kingdoms. Each ruler is really looking to get more by squeezing out what he can from the commoners. And this evolutionary process plays out. Each of these kingdoms centralizes authority within its own territory. They have bureaucrats who can tax. They have kings who can authorize the taking of money and spend it on defense and make any laws that they might need. But gradually, over the course of time, more and more power comes to one king in the name of protection. This king conquers or encourages others to submit to his authority in the name of this protection. And eventually you have this odd form of co-optation where you've got the clergy, known as the first estate, which administers the legal system. You've got this aristocracy, known as the second estate, which executes the king's wars. And then you've got the mercantile elite, known as the third estate, which gathers taxes. So they've each got, they remind you in some ways of the whole feudal evolution, which we talked about in the British case, which was also going on in France, this movement from feudalism. And so there was this sense of obligation and responsibility. So the clergy administers the legal system, the aristocracy executes the king's wars, and the mercantile elites gathers the taxes. Everyone's got their role. All these groups, these three estates, got to be represented in the Estates Generales, which was a pseudo-parliament founded at the start of the 14th century. Although not all these groups were in it until the 15th century, so it took a while before the mercantile elites and everybody was actually represented there. So the Estates Generales was really critical to the French wars. And remember, this is Europe, right? We're talking about wars all over the place. These city-states that are evolving, turning into states, trying to get the better of other states. And so you've got wars going on. And Parliament, this Estates Generales, this proto-parliament, allows the king or queen, whoever's there at the time, to levy taxes. And Parliament actually administers the taxation system, thanks to the clergy. So after the 100 Years' War, interestingly enough, after the 100 Years' War, Parliament actually renounces its... Are you eating candy?
Not anymore.
Not anymore? Okay, no eating more candy, okay? Sorry. This wouldn't happen in class, would it? So after the 100 Years' War, this Estates Generales actually renounces this right to levy, to allow the crown to levy taxes. They give it back to the monarch. And this makes them redundant. And so Louis XI in the 15th century begins to ignore the Estates Generales and strengthens more and more until Louis XIV, a few centuries later, declares that he is the state. So the Estates Generales really fell to the side. Now the problem for any king, as we've noticed in the British case, both in the case of the UK and in the case of America, is you can only levy so much taxes, and you can only get away with it for so long. There's only so much you can squeeze. And so in France, the countryside was starving. They were out of cash for wars. And so Louis XVI needed some sort of representative body that would allow him to squeeze a little bit more. And so he convened the Estates Generales in 1789. So why did he do this? He did this because he was broke. Okay? So he didn't do it because he was a believer in democracy, but he did it because it was in his own self-interest. The same reason that King John signed on to the Magna Carta. So the Estates Generales comes together in 1789, and there's a procedural fight because the third estate, this mercantile elite, wants a greater role in this parliamentary body since they represent more people. The king says no. And so people go out, they protest, they revolt, they storm the Bastille, which is the jailhouse, on July 14th, 1789, and this is the French Revolution. So here you have the storming of the Bastille, and here you have the nasty stuff that follows, which we'll get to in a second. So the Third Estate establishes a new National Assembly and issues this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And this is a first step towards a constitution. It defines a single set of individual and collective rights for all men and ostensibly women. Everyone says men, though. These are natural rights. These are universal. They go across time and space. You're born into them. And in fact, here's a quote: "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good." Do note there's nothing here about women. There's nothing about revoking slavery per se. So there's some shortcomings. Uh, and this is how democracy evolves in all the advanced democracies, which raises a question. Well, I'm not going to ask that question now. But you'll have lots of non-democratic regimes today that say, hey, look, we need to evolve to a democratic flag. We can't just have democracy today or tomorrow like this. We need to evolve in that direction. And so they can point to these cases and say, hey, look, you've slowly evolved even after your revolutions. So what happens with all this, the Declaration of the Rights of Men, this new National Assembly, they demand the destruction of all these aristocratic privileges that have been going on for centuries and centuries, by proclaiming an end to exemptions from taxation, again, the freedom and equal rights for all men, access to public office based on talent. This is an important point of the French system, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So what they do is they destroy hereditary and religious privileges, giving all the men the right to vote, and promising, well, all free men, and promising to guarantee natural rights of freedom and equality. So, after this promise of benevolence, what might have prompted France's reign of terror? We've got some preliminary lessons from our conceptual readings, and one of those preliminary lessons is what? Right. Post-revolutionary terror is quite typical. So in 1791, this is what happens. You've got a new constitutional proposal with this whole Declaration of the Rights of Men serving as the preamble. And this constitutional proposal would give some rights back to the monarchy. The Jacobins, or Jacobins, again, don't cringe, are these radicals who launched a class war under Robespierre. And this is like the left going against the right. You've got conservative monarchists, pro-clerics on the right. And so this is a reign of terror that the Jacobins launched. It's like a foreshadowing of Stalinism or Maoism to a certain degree. They went crazy. There was terror to the point that they ultimately turned on themselves, killing Robespierre in 1794. So in the 10 months that this went on for, from 1793 to 1794, again over this constitutional proposal, you have between 16 and 40,000 people killed. These were all, quote-unquote, enemies of the revolution. The way they died were, as you see in this slide down here, the guillotine. Revolutionary tribunals condemned them to the guillotine, cut off their heads, and that was it. So if you look at the division of who died in this, it's pretty interesting. 18% of the victims were aristocrats, so from the old order. 6% were clergy, again from the old order. 4% were middle class, and you could argue that there were maybe some of the mercantile elites who were aligned with the old order. But then 72%, nearly three-quarters, were workers or peasants. And so these were the people who didn't benefit under the old order and were certainly not benefiting under the new order because of this reign of terror. These were people, and why were they killed? They were killed because they were accused of hoarding, evading the draft, desertion, rebellion, or other purported minimal crimes, but not sticking up for the revolution. So lots got, quote-unquote, caught up in the revolutionary violence, as frequently happens. Eventually, a weak government is established. It's a very ineffective government, and it goes on for a few years. And then you've got a typical resolution. What do you expect to find if you've got a weak government that isn't capable of providing for the people's needs, that people think is inefficient, ineffective? Well, who steps in? Ding, 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 ding. Yep, that's right, the military. So you've got a military coup. And General Napoleon Bonaparte launches his coup, and he does this in order to, quote-unquote, finalize the revolution. Again, what does the military do? Well, they do the same thing. They want to fix things. They want to put us back on the right path. And so that's what Napoleon does. He wants to see equality before the law, the separation of church and state, meritocracy in the civil service. And he promises all these great things, and then he turns dictator. But like many, he was a dictator who people supported because he was certainly better from the commoner's perspective than the chaos that they emerged from. this inability to govern. So maybe we need a dictator now, was the sort of line of the day. Peace and stability is nice for voters or a population who no longer can vote. And so they did vote in an 1804 plebiscite to make him emperor for life. So he launches a coup, series of wars. Well, let's take this in a separate slide.